It was very destabilizing for a while, and in a sense, I was kind of. It's probably kind of for the best that I was as sort of grounded in like science and so forth as I was, because otherwise I think I could have been completely swept off my feet by it and not really been quite sure which way up was. And the ayahuasca obviously does, as you said, give some people like an idea of what to believe. But I think if you believe there's some kind of innate wisdom to it, it knew that that wasn't going to work for me because having come from a sort of religious background, I very much sort of shy away from, like static belief systems. So for me, it was much more about, okay, go out there and explore, was kind of what I got from it.
Abi Millar, thanks for joining me on the podcast. It's really nice to have the chance to talk to you about your new book.
Thank you. I'm really enjoying the podcast. I'm thrilled to be here.
Oh, great to hear. The new book is called The Spirituality Gap, Searching for Meaning in a Secular Age. Is this your first book? I know that you're a journalist, but is it your first book?
It's my first published book, yes.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And I think you were a science journalist initially, right?
Yeah, predominantly. I very much call myself a generalist. I've sort of flitted about between subjects, but I've definitely gravitated to things with a more sciencey bent. So, yeah, I guess that's what I'm just anything that sparks my curiosity, really. And science certainly is that.
Hmm. So I know, having written a couple small books myself, I know it takes a lot of work and a lot of persistence to get a book to publishing, and especially one like yours, which I think it sounds like you researched over a number of years. So what was like the driving force behind this book? Like what compelled you to go on this journey?
So it's a book that's been marinating in my mind for many, many years. I wrote the book itself quite quickly, but as you kind of allude to, the research process went on, for many years prior to that, and the ideas were there before then. Um, to give a bit of background, I grew up as an evangelical Christian, so kind of very, very deep into that world. And like many evangelical Christians do, I lost my faith as a teenager and probably swung the other way as well. It became quite sort of stridently atheistic back in the heyday of Dawkins and Hitchens, new atheists. But after a certain time point, I began to feel this wasn't satisfying. That the whole kind of paradigm I was within was sort of too rigid, and I I mean, it's a bit of a longer story, but the short version is I started to kind of take spirituality a bit more seriously, but work out what that might mean. Um, was there a way that I could kind of reconcile this burgeoning desire for something more spiritual, just a source of meaning in my life, with my, rational faculties? I didn't want to switch those off in the process. And so the book was really born from kind of a desire to sort of reconcile both parts of my mind, I suppose.
Hmm. Yeah, I can relate. I've been wrestling with those two sides of myself for years. The kind of conditioned, rational mind that wants to question every strange phenomenon, every synchronicity, and then the part of me that is just so open to that. And I think I found something of a kind of semi-coherent, collaborative relationship between those two parts of myself. Like one deserves its space and time, and so does the other. And not having them in conflict. It's been a long journey for me. Um, so for you, like, yeah, you were going to say something.
No, I was just agreeing that it is incredibly hard. There's not really kind of a straightforward approach to it, which is why I wanted to write something that specifically looks into how we can bridge those two halves. Because
Right.
I also find that within the sort of the field of publishing, certainly you have lots of books that are kind of very, very rationalist and probably quite derogatory about spirituality in some ways. Um, Less so now than you did in the heyday of the new atheists, but I believe that's still a bit of a publishing niche. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you have the books you would often find in the spirituality section, which can be I don't want to denigrate them, but they can be a little bit away with the fairies. And if you're trying to read them with the rational mind on, it's it can be a bit frustrating road, you know. So I thought there was a place for something that really did try to kind of bridge both in whatever way I could.
Hmm. Yeah, I think, whenever we're too one-sided about something, it's not quite satisfying, it's not quite enough, and requires sometimes like standing firm in your beliefs, you know, and like this is one of the things that Carl Jung always cautioned against is noticing when you've become one-sided about something. You tend to get dogmatic and kind of rigid in your beliefs and judgments about the other side. And so like a big part of I think his project was learning how to hold the tension of the opposites was how he put it. But somehow finding this middle ground for us modern people, many of whom feel like post-religious, like we can't just give ourselves over to a belief system, a doctrine. It's like for me, it's like I feel like I just know too much about the history of religion and we've had so much work over the past 50 years on comparative mythology and comparative religion that you start to see the kind of archetypal universality of religions. And so it becomes really hard to just give yourself over to belief. So then, how do we proceed? How do we find meaning beyond just the material aspects of life? Um, mm,
Absolutely, and even from the standpoint of 50 years ago, I imagine, well, certainly, you know, my grandparents have just gone to church because everyone around them went to church, and there wouldn't have been that kind of exposure to other ways of seeing the world. You couldn't just go online and find out about anything you wanted to. And these days, we're so kind of like exposed to all kinds of information, and we're so hyper aware of the way that different people think that it's really kind of quite hard to hold to the idea that my belief system is right, my religion is the one true religion. Obviously, there are still some people who derive a lot of comfort from thinking that, but I think it's becoming harder and harder to maintain the more information you're exposed to.
hmm. Yeah, and I think it was kind of a big moment when Joseph Campbell had his The Power of Myth conversations with Bill Moyers. I think that was like in the 80s or maybe early 90s. But more of this comparative mythology and comparative religion found its way out of academia and into the mainstream. And there's a reason why that television show and the accompanying book was made such an impact on the culture. Because I think for a lot of people, it was their first exposure to this, archetypal universality of different stories from around the world, and even just the idea of Christianity as being a myth and just one myth in a whole plethora of different mythologies that gave people a sense of meaning and purpose in life.
Yeah, I love Joseph Campbell, and I think that's absolutely true. So you kind of start to sort of think, okay, we are looking at you know our beliefs through more of a sort of mythic lens rather than in a sort of strictly true lens, then why would you want to kind of like hold so dearly to this particular narrative? I'm thinking particularly of fundamentalist Christianity here, that's so clearly been proven to have its sort of holes in. And why would you want to kind of abide by dogmas when um, it seems kind of increasingly obvious that that's just a sort of distillation of something a bit deeper? It's quite a hard thing to explain, but I think a lot of people, you're right, are kind of converging on a similar way of seeing that.
Hmm. Yeah, I think one way to look at it is literalism. That, in contrast to the kind of mythic perspective. Right. So you're looking at the surface and you're taking it as true. I mean, this is what fundamentalism of any kind really is. And then there's the people like Joseph Campbell and Carl Jung who are looking deeper beyond the kind of surface layers of the story and seeing how it's like this mycelial network of story that sprouts up in different times and cultures in its own unique form, but it has its roots in the same kind of well, archetypal reality or truths that are really, I think, the source of that deeper meaning for us, you know. And so, yeah, what does it give people to believe in a doctrine? Well, like you said, I think it gives them some comfort and security. Things get to a little more ambiguous, ambivalent when we're outside of the doctrine and we're seeing, well, this is like actually a story. And I think we're conditioned in our culture to think of imagination and story as you know, frivolous or just entertainment or but stories hold deep meaning and they've served, even Western culture for a long time.
That's it. And there's something kind of really there's something kind of like really kind of closely connected, I think, about the way that we might um, interpret a myth or any other kind of narrative really as being true on one level and not true on another level, and the way we might apply the same thing to a belief system. I think they're fundamentally the same, really. It's like a myth or even just a story is not kind of true in its own terms, but it is true in a much deeper sense that most of us can understand. And I really would kind of hold that the same applies to, religions and so forth. And the question, I guess, now for many people is what kind of system can we actually find, like whether it's a system of kind of images or meaning or just something that kind of resonates when the old certainties have been stripped away, the old stories seem to hold less meaning. Where do we find our stories now? So that was something I was really interested in exploring in the book.
Yeah, and I guess each one of these sectors of the spiritual scene that you explored, they each well, they're each its own kind of story about, what the practice is, what the substance in the case of ayahuasca, what it is and what it does. And so, yeah, like each chapter where you explore these different areas or different practices, it's kind of like you're going into that world, that mythology, that story that the people who practice those things adhere to in some sense. Um, I think the first experience that you write about is with ayahuasca, but it was very kind of non-traditional type of ceremony, if we want to use that word even, but I was kind of amused to hear about this, like just the way it was all conducted and that it happened in like a kind of a warehouse in Amsterdam or something. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the
Well,
setting
first of
was
all, but before you talk about the experience, like to do something like ayahuasca requires like a level of extreme curiosity or extreme desperation, or maybe both. And so, like, yeah, just I'd love to hear a little bit if you could share about like why would you take that leap to do something like that can be so scary?
I think that that's absolutely bang on the money. At that point in time, both applied to me 100%. I was extremely curious. I always have been really about what was going on with psychedelics. I'd taken other psychedelics prior to that, and I'd always heard ayahuasca talked about as being just in a different sort of league. So there was a part of me that was a bit sort of like, oh, I've got to have I've got to see what that's all about. But I don't think that would have been in itself would have been enough to kind of make me go there because it is frankly terrifying. And I was going through a very difficult period in life. So I was in my early 30s and I'd had a very, I suppose, just a relentless year. I'd had a breakup and then I'd have to sleep on a friend's floor for 6 weeks and left my cat and my work was going nowhere, and then I had another fling and another breakup, and everything was just a bit chaotic. And I was living in another country away from my friends. And then my dad died very suddenly, and that was just such an overpowering shattering of my reality sense of reality that I just felt. I was kind of unsupported in a foreign country and grieving heavily, didn't really have anyone around me. And I was so just desperate to try anything that might make things better.
Hmm. Hmm.
So that's the headspace I went into it from.
Yeah, and how did you find these what do we call them? Facilitators or practitioners?
Facilitators, I think anything else would be generous.
Because they're
Um,
not traditional medicine people or shaman, right? So these are like Western people.
they were Western people, and um, I don't think they were the most like scrupulous in the way they conducted themselves and so forth. And it wasn't the best setting, to be honest. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend that you just go down the route I did of going online and going looking for the cheapest possible option in Amsterdam, because it didn't go that well. It
Is
was
that
it
what
was
you were actually Googling? Is like cheap ayahuasca ceremony Amsterdam?
pretty much, yeah. So again, I don't say this as a recommendation to anybody else. This is just a sign of how desperate I was. But
Hmm.
yes, it was in a slightly shady industrial estate just outside of Amsterdam, and that I think a lot of what people do derive from an ayahuasca ceremony is that sense of kind of real like guidance from the shamans or the facilitators, whoever it is. It didn't really quite have that in this case, but the medicine itself was powerful enough to override that. It wasn't really an issue for me.
Hmm. And they were not interfering enough that you could have this experience with the medicine.
Yeah, they kind of let us to our own devices, which was actually pretty really for the best.
Hmm.
So I felt safe enough at the time.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting that you took each kind of portion of what is normally brewed as a tea, you took them separately. So the MAOI you took separately from the DMT containing. I mean, was this derived from the plants, or was it some kind of what they call like a pseudohuasca or some kind of other kind of blend?
To my knowledge, it was the real thing. I'd have been really disappointed if I found out subsequently that it wasn't, and it certainly seemed to function like the real thing. I didn't actually realise that it wasn't traditional to have them separately. Actually the first I've heard of that. So yeah, but I don't think it diminished the experience.
Hmm. So you're in this industrial part of Amsterdam. You're probably on some little mattress or something in a room.
Yeah.
Um, And you're going in as a kind of like a scientifically oriented, maybe even skeptical of like New Age woo or spirituality. Can you talk a little bit about the experience? And did you go in with a feeling of like openness or with some of that skepticism?
I'd say with both. So at this point, I'd long stopped calling myself an atheist. And because I was kind of grieving, I felt very open
Hmm.
to different ways of seeing the world in a way that I perhaps wouldn't have done previously. And I'd had previous experiences with psychedelics that had kind of seemed to point my mind to something a bit different. But I think that yeah, I was still very much operating within the typical kind of like Western paradigm. There's no way I'd have countenanced any sort of unconventional metaphysics or anything like that. I was very much, a physicalist, and very, very much loved kind of my science. And I would always have seen kind of like that as overriding what I perceived to be kind of like woo. Yeah.
Hmm.
Um, and the experience I had completely changed that. It just left me sort of so open to the idea that reality is not what I thought it was. And it didn't necessarily show me what reality was, but it just kind of gave me this sense of like how vast and incomprehensible it is, and how foolish it is to sort of stick too rigidly within whatever paradigm you have.
Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting that it can kind of loosen your own attachment to an idea of what reality is without offering you some concrete uh, replacement theory of the universe. That's because sometimes it does. Sometimes
Mm.
people come away and they're like, "Oh, this is what ayahuasca is. This mother," and and they come out with this whole cosmology that in place, and it becomes a kind of another dogma of sorts. Um, but I was thinking about the word skepticism and the skeptic because it's in your book, and you do talk about that in the introduction as being a kind of mindset. Um, and it's interesting, like the little I know about skepticism, like the philosophy, is that it wasn't about disbelieving as this kind of like other kind of rigid stance, but it was like more about like suspending judgment
Mm.
until you have better like evidence for the conclusion. And I think it acknowledges that like there are some forms of knowledge that are impossible for us to really gain, or to be as like kind of concrete capital T truth. And I think that's a little more of a nuanced definition or understanding of skepticism than what we might normally think, where it's like a Richard Dawkins who is just um, not going to allow for anything beyond the physical or the provable in that sense, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think the kind of the way you've described it is perfect. For me, it's part and parcel of being as open-minded as you possibly can be. Um, I sort of received some commentary about the way I wrote that I managed to balance skepticism and open-mindedness really well. And I sort of thought, well, actually, they're the same thing, really.
Yeah, I
It's
think so.
not yeah.
Hmm. Yeah. So, did you go into the ayahuasca ceremony with any like a therapeutic mindset? Had you been thinking about, I've been through this trauma and I've heard that ayahuasca can help heal trauma somehow, maybe by, thinking as a materialist, like by rewiring my brain or releasing something that's held in my body?
Yeah, there was certainly a bit of that. I mean, I'd heard the old kind of ayahuasca is equivalent to 10 years on a therapist's couch thing. You probably heard the same thing.
Oh, yes, many times. It's bullshit,
um,
by the way.
yeah, yeah. So there was a part of me that's attracted to that, mostly because I'm very impatient. So if I can kind of somehow
Cram it all in.
exactly cram it all in one night, then I was up for that. So yeah, I think I definitely went into it through that standpoint. I didn't necessarily go into it expecting to have my beliefs about reality shattered, but based on, I suppose, trip reports I'd read, I was kind of open to that. I knew that it was a possibility.
Hmm. And I think like it's what you said about part of like your attitude of openness being because of the grief. I mean, that's such an important point, is that if we allow it, grief really does kind of open us in a way that I think it'd be wise to tend to that. Um, and also like having curiosity about what it could open us to is maybe part of like the healing function of grief in a way. Um, but it's not something I often hear people talk about. Is like the grief, the sorrow, the pain is what kind of opened me to this other way of seeing the world and being in the world. Like it's like the Leonard Cohen quote that gets thrown around a lot. It's like the crack is where the light gets in.
Yeah, I was just thinking of that quote. Yeah.
Yeah, well, he's like a Canadian patron saint, for us grief mongers. Yeah. Okay, so how was it for you following that? Like your sense of reality gets shattered. Were you able to pick up the pieces somehow, or?
Well, it was very destabilizing for a while, and in a sense, I was kind of it's probably kind of for the best that I was as sort of grounded in like science and so forth as I was, because otherwise, I think I could have been completely swept off my feet by it and not really been quite sure which way up was. Um, so for a while, it was kind of deeply confusing. I felt quite lost. I felt like something very profound had happened, and that. Um, my sense of kind of what the world was had been altered in a way that was just there was no going back from it whatsoever. But I wasn't really sure what that meant. But that was a big part of why I started to explore some of the other practices I look at in the book. It was a
Hmm.
sense of okay, there's something here, but what is it, and how can I give expression to it? And yeah, so it was just really at the start of a kind of big journey of what's it all about. And the ayahuasca obviously does, as you said, give some people like an idea of what to believe. But I think if you believe there's some kind of innate wisdom to it, it knew that that wasn't going to work for me because having come from a sort of religious background, I'd very much sort of shy away from, like static belief systems. So for me, it was much more about, okay, go out there and explore was kind of what I got from it.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, that's great. It's like it kind of catered. your experience to you.
Yeah.
It's nice to think about. That it like saw you and saw like what would work for you and knew about your curiosity, right? About things. Like to be a scientifically curious person is can be somewhat similar to being a spiritually or philosophically curious person. It's like about what's behind the surface, like what makes this thing tick or what makes people tick. That's why I'm a kind of a psychologist. It's like I want to know what makes people tick. Um, yeah, and so like it just reminds me too of that another trope. God, there's a lot of tropes that we're bringing up in this conversation, but that every quest begins with a question. So what was the question that ayahuasca left you with that you were seeking to find an answer to?
So one of the kind of real sort of take home messages I got, which almost felt like a kind of weird kind of challenge from the medicine, was how can you learn to have faith without belief?
Hmm.
Because I had this sense of kind of faith as being something that was like deeply, deeply important. And it's something that kind of I know kind of can help people through difficult times, give them a sense of meaning, just kind of add some kind of extra layer to life. But prior to that, it had just felt completely inaccessible to me as somebody who didn't have a belief system. So I wanted to know, is there a way of locating whatever this thing is, faith, this sense of kind of sure, like certain, not certainty, but kind of somewhat deep underlying rootedness without necessarily having a particular single narrative to anchor it in. And I guess
Yeah.
that's what, yeah.
I love a good question. It's like the Rilke line about it's better to live the questions and let it lead to maybe some kind of answer, but live with the question and see where it takes you. And this is such a big question: how to have faith without belief. Talk a little bit about what you understand faith to mean. What is that?
I suppose some people do use it synonymously with belief. Like they refer to kind of their Christian faith to kind of mean the structure of beliefs. But I think there is a deeper meaning to it as well, which is more what I'm getting at, which is this sort of I don't know if it's just like an attitude to life, a sort of saying yes to life, a sense of kind of trusting the flow of
Yeah,
life.
I was thinking trust has something to do with
Yeah.
trust, right?
Yeah, and it's something that I really struggle with. I struggle a lot with anxiety, like most overthinkers do. And the idea of kind of trusting some kind of like nebulous force that I don't even understand is like the hardest thing I can imagine. I've got no idea really where to begin with that. So the concept of faith feels like kind of quite an attractive thing to have.
Yeah. Yeah, especially when life is filled with so much uncertainty and everything.
Yeah.
Faith is an attractive thing. But like you said, I think like maybe we can look at it like belief is like the foundation of faith. It's like what faith is built upon or what it stands on. And so if I have a doctrine about, how the world was created and what we're here for, um, and I really truly believe that, it gives me faith that, whatever I encounter in life, whatever difficulties or challenges, that it's all for this bigger purpose,
Yeah.
right? So, like, as science-oriented person, someone who, believes in science, believes the science, um, what kind of faith would that give them? Because science would say, well, current science, accepted science now, whatever, maybe there's alternative, um, you know, forms of science that have different ideas. But the way science stands now, it's like we're here as biological beings. We're here to reproduce, to continue the genetic line. And when we die, consciousness kind of shuts down because it comes from the brain. So when the brain stops functioning, so does consciousness. And then we turn into, worm food and we get put back in the cycle of material existence. Um, is that enough faith to kind of navigate the world of suffering?
Well, I think for me personally, no. I'm sure there are lots of people who kind of have stuck with that as a foundational belief system and have found a way to kind of find a sense of meaning on top of that. I know there are, but for me that was never enough, and that was part of why I started searching kind of greater answers. I mean, after doing ayahuasca, I tend much more to, um, I suppose, I wouldn't necessarily say I'm a panpsychist, but I tend to believe systems that kind of put consciousness being more primary than matter in some ways, and um, I don't think that's incompatible with a scientific approach. I think that if you kind of, I mean, I'm certainly not a physicist. I don't know too much about any of this, but I think there's people who are kind of working out there on the kind of extreme frontiers of physics who kind of would say the same thing. Um, so when you can, I've heard that sort of like biologists tend to be atheists, but then by the time you get to physicists, they tend to be a lot more out there in what they believe. So
Yeah, at
um,
least agnostic,
yeah,
maybe.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Not necessarily believing in God per se, but definitely something probably more akin to what I'm talking about.
Yeah, like when we get to quantum physics and all of that, to me it seems indistinguishable from like metaphysics
Yeah,
or, a kind of spirituality. Like there's still those the big questions that you can't really quite explain. And so there is a kind of there's a belief system activating there. Like there's a belief in the theory, of whatever it is. Um, so it's maybe like a kind of a new religion in a way. You talked about Bernardo Kastrup and this idea of like consciousness being primary or coming, yeah, I guess primary is the right word, right? Like before material existence, there is consciousness. That to me, that's a hard one to wrap my head around. It sounds like, the kind of the big creator God idea. In the beginning, there was the word, there was mind or consciousness.
yeah, yeah. There probably is an awful lot of overlap with it for sure. And I have no idea whether Kastrup is right about any of what he says. Um, but I also have no idea whether the typical kind of scientific materialist view is right either. I just feel like I just don't know.
Mhm.
Um, so I suppose, kind of, yeah. My question is, how can I have this faith when I feel fundamentally like I just don't know? Is there something I can kind of relax into, a sense of kind of being held by something bigger if I don't know what it is? And yeah, I just see myself as kind of like, I'm a monkey. What can I possibly know about fundamental reality? But is
Mhm.
there a way I can kind of sort of lean into whatever it is and feel whatever it is? You know what
Yeah.
I mean?
Oh, totally. And when I read that, your phrase about, can I have, or the question, can I have faith without belief? It reminded me of what my friend Tony Wolff, who I've had on the podcast, what he calls poetic faith. And I think it's a term he got from Coleridge, and it refers to like a suspension of disbelief so that we can engage in some kind of meaningful experience, something that is not speaking to our rational mind, but speaking to our meaning making function. And we can do that kind of provisionally. So I think of it also rather than suspension of disbelief as something I've got to shut down, but it's like a provisional belief or faith in the moment, which is like kind of a phenomenological uh, attitude where it's like whatever's happening, just take it as being real because in this moment it is real. And you might question it later, but allow yourself the experience of being swept up in something that is, is spontaneous, surprising, strange, inexplicable, irrational. So it's like allowing yourself to give yourself over to that experience in the moment. And then, whatever you do with it later, fine, you can psychologize it, you can try to, you know, nail it down to quantum physics or biology or chemistry or whatever. But in the moment, I think that's where maybe something like this middle ground is like an ability to flow in between states or something, or states of receptivity versus analysis or something like that.
Yeah, I really love that. I think that's a really wonderful framing of it because I've obviously heard about suspension of disbelief in relation to, well, fictional narratives. I guess that ties into what we were talking about earlier, the relationship between
About
the sort of,
story, right? Oh,
yeah. But I'd never really thought about it before in relation to, yeah, this question. But I think it's absolutely bang on. And certainly, I found that kind of if I allow my sort of overthinking
Oh,
mind to intrude.
jeez.
Oh.
Sorry, my dog's activated here. Let's just pause for a second while the
Okay.
delivery person, I think, one second. We take care of this. Sorry. Hey, if you haven't already, take a moment, like this video and subscribe to the channel. It actually really helps. And look, if you really want to support the podcast, consider becoming a Patreon member. Starting at just $5 a month, you get early release of all episodes weeks before they're out to the public with no ads, no interruptions. We do a monthly call where we get together and we talk about topics like the one we're talking about on this podcast, me and you and other cool people. And you get other stuff. There's a private RSS feed that you can subscribe to and listen to extra bonus content on your favorite podcast player. It's really great and it's growing. So go to patreon.com/howl in the wilderness and join up.
Oh, I remember what I was saying. Yeah, I was saying that yeah, with the practices that I've tried, when I allow my sort of overthinking rational mind to intrude too much, which I do have a tendency to do, it really ruins the experience. I don't derive any sort of like spiritual fulfillment from it or any sense of meaning really. And so I definitely take the stance that it's yeah, as you say, perfectly fine to switch that side of myself back on afterwards. But at the time, I have to operate as if, you know, this is true, whatever it is I'm doing. For instance, I read tarot a lot. I love tarot. And I think I love it in particular because it's not like a fixed set of meanings. It's very fluid and very flexible, and the cards can change their meanings depending on the context, on the day, on your mood, that kind of thing. Um, and when I'm reading tarot, I allow myself to kind of believe completely that this is some kind of definitive message, and I can trust it. And then afterwards, of course, I can, you know, I can think of it in a million different ways, like what's going on there. Um, but it really doesn't help the experience to think that at the time. If I kind of think I'm just sort of constructing meanings out of randomness, then I don't find that particularly useful, you know?
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Doesn't really give you a whole lot. Yeah. I mean, one of the things that I think is really helpful about something like ayahuasca is that you don't really have a choice to about shutting off the rational mind a lot of the
Mm.
time. You know, any kind of strong practice, whether that comes through ayahuasca or mushrooms or DMT or maybe breath work in some cases, um, it's not something you do consciously. It's like that suspension of disbelief or shutting off the rational mind. It's just like you're thrown into the kind of the symbolic world or the, you know, the mythic world or whatever. Um, so then if you don't have something that strong that kind of pushes you through the door or through, you know, the rabbit hole, um, are you able to consciously like notice when you're being analytical or rational and switch that off? Because I'm not sure that I can, or if maybe that's not my kind of my default mode. Maybe I'm more inclined to the kind of openness of the mystical experience. But is that something that you've noticed and you're able to kind of shut off for the moment?
Yeah, I think to a greater or lesser extent, I think probably tarot, as I say, is like the best place that I kind of notice this because it is a practice for me. I do readings fairly frequently, and um, it's almost kind of like a lesson for me in just how to shut that part of myself off
Mm,
because it feels very profound and even sacred when I do my readings. And the days when I kind of approach it from the spectrum of oh what's the point of this anyway? I'm just making it up. I'm just not going to derive anything from it, and it just strips away that you know that sense of the sacred about it. You know?
yeah, yeah, yeah. And yeah, that maybe speaks to the importance of a practice. Having a practice where you're engaged with you know, a symbolic world or a symbolic worldview or that kind of thing, whether that's working with dreams. Because dreams will do that for you too. I mean, dreams are just so strange. I don't think you know, there's no way the explanation that dreams are just like the kind of the refuse of the previous day or whatever, you know, the mind processing experience. Um, that kind of explanation, the reductionist explanation just doesn't hold up with a lot of dreams if you're paying attention, because some dreams just seem to come out of nowhere and so strange, and sometimes it's like they've been constructed just for you to give you some kind of insight or guidance in your life. And I think maybe like when people say they don't dream, which is not true. It's just that they're not remembering their dreams. And remembering dreams is a kind of practice that you have to kind of keep well oiled. Otherwise, you lose it pretty quick. And maybe the forgetting of the dream is the defense against the irrational, just as like a reductionist explanation would be.
Yeah, I really like that idea. I think our culture encourages us to dismiss the insights we get in dreams,
Yeah.
certainly. Like we're not encouraged to kind of sit down and journal about what we've just experienced. And I guess, yeah, with that does come a sense of forgetting. Um, and I'd probably place sort of synchronicities that you experience in your waking life in the same category as that. Like there could be such profound messages there if you listen to them, but we're not really encouraged to listen to them. We're encouraged to dismiss them, just see it as coincidence. And I think that's really sad. I mean, that's another way in which I think it's I regularly try to suspend my disbelief. If I do experience a kind of a synchronicity that seems incredibly powerful and meaningful and pointing me in a certain direction, I'm just going to listen to that. I'm not going to be like, no,
Hmm.
it just seems like a waste of the experience to overanalyze it.
Yeah. Yeah. Or to denigrate it or write it off as something,
Yeah.
yeah. So there's something there about like of practice, about keeping this kind of the mythic muscle um, toned and active. So, right? Like there's like doing tarot or dream journaling, or even better, I think sharing your dreams with someone else. That was a daily practice for a lot of people and still is in some more intact traditional cultures. First thing you do is you want to share your dream, because it's not about you kind of doing some kind of psychological analysis for yourself, but it's the idea that the dream is a messenger, and maybe the message isn't for you alone. Maybe it's for someone else. So it's kind of your obligation to share your vision from the night before. And I really like that because it takes us out of that hyper individualized focus of all this stuff. Like, what's it all for? Well, it's for my personal growth and healing,
Yeah,
which again is just so limiting that I think we lose a sense of bigger meaning if that's our view.
absolutely. We've lost so much. And although I didn't go into it in great depth in my book, I did include a chapter about sort of like neo-shamanism and sort of whether these kind of ways of seeing the world could be experiencing a revival. I think kind of part of the problem is they're being packaged in a very individualistic context. So you're not going to have this sort of experience of being in a kind of tribal society where everyone is sort of um, you know kind of believing these sort of the same things in the same way and tapped into the same wavelength. It's very much like you can go on YouTube and you can learn to kind of hypnotize yourself essentially, and it's very kind of lacking in that sense, I believe. Although I do think it's great that we're kind of perhaps collectively becoming more open to the idea that there's some wisdom to these traditions.
Hmm. Yeah, and like a big challenge for me was, okay, some of these practices really work. They're giving me something that is meaningful. How can I incorporate them into my life in a way that doesn't feel, um, well, like appropriative, but in a very kind of material sense? Like, how am I just using this for myself, or how am I like warping it to kind of fit what I'm comfortable with, or so that's always that's like an ongoing thing for me, is looking at the practices that work for me and trying to find my way. The way I put it is like trying to find my way towards something like a Western shamanism that kind of revives some of these, what I believe are universal practices, but does it in a way that's true to, like, speaking personally, who I am and the time and place in which I've sprouted up, or which I've landed. And that's maybe like a lifelong project for me. But I wonder if it's something that you've wrestled with getting into, like ayahuasca or neo-shamanism. Not so much a problem with something like tarot and astrology, because those are practices that come out of Western culture, right? So less kind of problematic in that way.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. It's certainly one that I wanted to explore because um, as you highlight, a lot of the way that these things are packaged, it's very appropriative, and it, there's something kind of very gross about um, just sort of taking kind of like little bits of other people's um, most profound experiences and just treating it like it's some sort of dressing up box that you're kind of grabbing bits out of. Sorry, I've had a 1 second. I think I was gesticulating too much. Not, um, yeah, I was something I've been really concerned about, and something I really wanted to avoid myself when I was exploring these practices, because it's a really easy trap to fall into, I believe. I mean, even doing ayahuasca, I felt like a little bit uneasy about it. What am I doing in my warehouse in Amsterdam, using this plant medicine derived from the Amazon? What is the ethic? What are the ethics there? And I'm still not entirely clear on the answer to that. Um, but yeah, I think certainly with shamanism, if we are going to find a way to, you know, to tap into it in a way that works for us as Westerners, it's not going to be just sort of ripping off what an entirely other culture has done. It's going to have to be kind of, tailored to fit us in some way. And I don't
Mm.
even know if it's just what Michael Harner did with core shamanism. I think his idea was there's some kind of common essence to all shamanic traditions across the world, and you can kind of take that and run with it. It might be that we have to find something that's a little bit more specifically tailored to us in our current cultural context.
Mm. Yeah, like I think Harner got a lot of things right, and I think his intentions were good. Um, but what I found with core shamanism, like the idea that, okay, it's universal that all cultures across time have had ways to induce trance states. And in those trance states, we can have a connection with something, and how that's framed depends on the culture, right? But something like about the spiritual world, just as a general term. I think that's really good. The thing about the way and core shamanism ended up rolling out is it became its own kind of religion, and it did require you to believe in the core tenets or the core kind of beliefs of this, that this is how we do it and this is what it is, and through this process you can do things like soul retrieval. And so I found, when I engaged in that, doing a couple weekend workshops on it to learn about it, I found that's where they lost me, was like how everybody involved in it all had shared the same belief system about what we're doing and how you do it. And I was like, okay, well, this is just like the kind of thing I want to avoid. Um, but at its essence, the idea that, okay, what's an efficient, effective way to induce a trance state? But it's the framing for me, which is something that I've been trying to develop, is like what is like an authentic framework for us Western people that does straddle that middle ground, the gap between rationality and complete belief or like total woo, you know? And so for me, it was like depth psychology offers a framework because it does hold a kind of middle position, like what we were talking about before, that kind of poetic faith of like, whatever's happening in the moment is real for you and it is significant. And about how we make meaning out of that, psychology has one perspective on it, but yeah, so it's like there's the technique and then there's the framework for me. And it's, the techniques are all out there, but it's the framework is the thing I think we need to develop further.
Absolutely, absolutely, and I really hope that kind of the people in our culture can sort of get their heads around that a little bit. And in the book, I spoke to a really interesting guy who basically had had what he could simultaneously perceive to be a sort of shamanic calling and a kind of mental breakdown. Um,
Hmm.
he kind of just had a kind of really sort of difficult mental health episode that sort of pushed him towards shamanism, and he kind of went out and basically kind of opened an ayahuasca retreat after many, many years. And he was so fascinating to speak to because he seemed to be able to hold both kind of paradigms in his mind, like at the same time, without any real conflict. It was just like it was like he was bilingual or something. He was just sort of translating as he went. He could see the world from a shamanic perspective, and he could see it from a Western scientific perspective, and he didn't see that there was really an issue there. But I think the ability to do that's probably quite uncommon, and so we could do with something that's a little bit more integrated.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Um, I'm wondering, like, out of all of the things that you explored, what kind of stuck for you? Like, what's working for you? What have you cobbled together for yourself, uh, following this whole journey and exploration of these different modalities?
Well, it's still very much a work in progress. There are still like lots of
Mm,
areas where I feel like I just need to go a bit deeper with that. For instance, I'm really bad at meditating. However many people kind of tell me that I need to sort of like work on meditation, I'm just so useless at it. So I'd love to kind of go deeper down that track. But what works for me day to day, I suppose, it's a combination of these sort of meaning making practices we've been talking about, like tarot. Um, and as I say, I gravitate to the ones where meaning is a bit more fluid and flexible. Um, and then practices that have got more of a sort of mind body kind of angle to them, where you're not really having to think about anything at all. You're just sort of very much in the experience, anything that just sort of takes you out of your head and into the direct experience. So I love running. So, and I kind of think running perhaps is a bit of an underlooked way that people can access a sense of spirituality. But when you kind of go deep into sort of running circles, you find that it's quite a common theme.
mm,
Um, and then another topic that I kind of explore is raves, and I think that's really interesting because of the sort of communal nature of the experience,
mm,
something that many of these practices are lacking. It does offer this sense of like collective effervescence where you're sort of like lost in this big mass experience. And so I find that anything like that sort of really just takes me out of my head is a very important kind of touch point with something a bit more numinous, as far as I'm
mm.
concerned.
Yeah. In your research, did you go down the route of like anthropology in terms of like what some of these traditional rituals and ceremonies, what they give us, like things like communitas, is this term that's used in cultural anthropology to describe that feeling of, the way I think about it is like if you're able to leave your ego at the door and you get into a kind of a group ritual, you lose yourself and you kind of merge with the group, which happens at a rave for sure, and can happen at an ayahuasca ceremony. But I think ayahuasca ceremonies for us Westerners, they're so kind of framed as for individual healing, individual insight that everyone is on their own little flying carpet, and sometimes the group experience breaks through that, but it's so focused on the individual that I don't know how much that's kind of central to the whole kind of neo-shamanic ayahuasca ritual, but definitely a rave. I think people go in knowing that it's all about this communal experience, and maybe it's drugs and it's the music and all of that, but allows people to kind of let go of their limited personhood and just get into the group, into this communitas experience. But did you look at any of those factors which might be the kind of the building blocks for meaning making? Like what makes experiences meaningful, I guess is maybe a more succinct question.
Yeah, to take the raves thing as an example, I did look a bit into the kind of cultural anthropology aspect of that. I looked into, I, I think the statistic is something like 92% of small scale tribal societies had some kind of ecstatic group rituals, generally involving music and dance, which was kind of their way of accessing these transcendent states and connecting with the divine. And I think there's kind of a lot of anthropological work to the effect that these sorts of um, these sorts of like big kind of group experiences of accessing whatever it is, sort of the starting point for a lot of religions. Um, and so I was definitely kind of fascinated to look at what that might mean for us today. Because, for instance, I wanted to get a sense of like where we are deriving our sense of spirituality anchored in community. And I looked at things like atheist churches, which are a really nice idea, but just don't seem to be doing the job at all. Like people,
Yeah.
yeah, people just don't want to kind of go and sit in like a church-like room, and sort of have a TED talk, and that. I mean,
Those are kind of like liturgies in a way, yeah.
yeah. I mean, it works for some people, but I think in terms of just sort of feeling what we're talking about here, people get it from. I don't write about it in the book. People get it from, big sports events and even kind of singing in a choir together, things like that. And yeah, definitely a rave is a really good example. And I spoke to kind of a scholar of raves who apparently that exists, a scholar of raves. He was great. But he talked about how there's like several different kind of aspects of the rave that kind of work as a sort of spiritual technology. Like it's almost like a reliable tool for kind of for you know
Yeah. Like the
um,
flashing lights, the loud music, the quality of the music, maybe the heat plays a part of that and the drugs, so something like that, yeah.
exactly, yeah. The rhythms, he looked into how the rhythms of a rave are kind of quite similar to West African possession dances, for instance, which
Mm,
was a fascinating parallel, and how the whole sort of structure of the experience is set up to kind of almost take you on like a journey from a certain starting point all the way to a peak. And also how often like rave culture comes with a sort of like set of values, like a ready-made kind of set of values.
right. Yeah, there's a kind of like etiquette and things that people are expected to know and to follow. So it's like,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, yeah, so there are these experiences where we can experience something like communitas, like a sports event or a rave. But like the curious thing that's still a question for me is like, well, then is there like real spiritual insight that comes out of those experiences? Like, is it lacking something like an intention toward the spiritual, like, whether that's, whatever kind of spiritual knowledge you might be looking for, but, as a reason to do the ritual or enter into that state, like I need some information about something, like some kind of divination or spiritual guidance or whatever it is, right? Like, so, like, it's like all of the elements are there to produce an ecstatic state, but if the intention toward some kind of acquisition of spiritual knowledge of some kind or spiritual connection, if that's not there, what's it all for?
Right, yeah. So what do you do with that raw experience? Absolutely, that's a really good
Yeah.
point.
Hmm.
Yeah. Um, and I know that within sort of the context of dance, you have lots of more kind of intentional practices like ecstatic dance, which really kind of do try to
Hmm.
sort of bring that intention to the party a little bit. Um, that probably isn't the main thing that distinguishes them from a typical rave, I suppose.
Yeah. Well, and they're kind of part of the whole new age wellness culture, you know?
Yeah.
It's like the intention is to like connect to your body, and often it's about disconnecting from others. Like you're expected to not like look at other people, to watch other people, or to engage with other people. You're supposed to be in your experience. So those things never are satisfying for me. I've explored them a little bit, and yeah. Um, but something like a rave is intriguing because it does on its surface seem so kind of hedonistic and secular, but people come away having these, I guess, religious insights in a way, like even if it's all like, if it's just like, we're all one man. I mean, that's kind of the ultimate religious insight, isn't it?
Yeah, you could say that. Um, yeah, part of what I meant about the value system is that I believe that kind of in some sort of rave communities, they have attempted to kind of expand on that a little bit and
Hmm.
to kind of define a sort of um, values. I mean, it's before my time, but as I understand it, in the 90s, they said, was it peace, love, unity, and respect, or something like that? I mean,
Mm.
it's pretty vague. It's not kind of like the Noble Eightfold Path or anything, but it's a sort of a semblance of some kind of system that you can kind of package these insights into.
Yeah, yeah. At least a nodding toward that, I guess. Um, is there any advice that you would have for somebody who, because I think like your experience and the way that you write will speak to a lot of people out there. You know, the growing number of spiritual but not religious types, the nuns, as they're called in some places. I think your experience will speak to people. So, is there like any advice that you could offer someone who is somewhat like yourself, who is seeking meaning, but not ready to dive all in on one particular belief system or give themselves over to the woo completely? What advice would you have for someone doing that kind of seeking?
Yeah, I think I kind of wrote the book almost for a version of my past self because I was so hung up on that question for a long time. Like I really wanted to sort of find out what spirituality was all about. But I was so kind of allergic to what I considered to be woo that it felt like a real sticking point for me. It felt like it was just inaccessible to me. And so I wanted to just kind of make the point that it really is accessible and you don't need to have a belief in anything as a price of entry. And maybe if you kind of come from that standpoint, it's best to start with something that's a little bit more mind body, um, where the point is just to kind of experience the world from a sort of more physical lens, perhaps, and just kind of see what happens, see what experiences you have. Um, I think kind of trying to sort of say just like believe in astrology or something if you've never kind of had that way of looking at the world before can be a little bit alienating.
Hmm.
But if so, okay, I'm going to go to a rave and just sort of see what comes up for me, then that's maybe a good starting point. But of course, it's going to be so individual depending on who you are. But I truly believe that spirituality should be accessible to absolutely anybody, and it's really sad that many of us in our society don't see it that way. Many of us just sort of don't even acknowledge that aspect of ourselves. And I'm sure it's kind of very much tied into like our collective mental health crisis as well. The fact that we just sort
Hmm.
of don't acknowledge this part of ourselves. So I want to make the case that you can acknowledge it, even if you don't like the term spirituality, even if that term is off-putting. There's something that it refers to, and there's something that you can access in it.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think like, the kind of public intellectuals, what they've been talking about in terms of like, John Vervaeke and his meaning crisis. So if you frame it not as a spiritual pursuit, but as a way to find meaning or to make meaning, maybe that's a good framework for the skeptical, rational type person.
Mm.
But what I'm hearing from you is like some of the advice is like see if you can like enter into these experiences and see if you can like just adjust your attitude to one of more kind of openness and curiosity and like leave the analytical rational mind at the door as much as you can. Something like so it's about like cultivating an attitude to see what's possible or what's available.
I think so. And you mentioned earlier that that could be maybe like for a lot of people, it does take something as kind of extreme as a psychedelic experience to kind of be able to do that in the first place. It certainly did for me. There was no way I was going to be able to kind of start doing that without the aid of something like ayahuasca. But other people may have a different kind of entry point into it. I do like your point as well that it could be reframed as a meaning crisis rather than getting hung up on the term spirituality, because I think the word spirituality or any words like soul or any other kind of word that could be used in this context can be really off-putting to someone who's comes from a sort of typical Western standpoint some of the time. But you don't have to use that terminology.
Yeah, but you might find yourself using that terminology reluctantly because those are the words that fit the kind of ineffability of the experience, These things,
Yeah.
these words that are really hard to define, and that's criticism of a word like spirituality. It's like, well, it doesn't really mean anything, because it means different things to everybody. It's like, well, yeah, but that word is serving a function for trying to communicate something of this ineffable experience. So sometimes we got to bring out the old, you spirit, soul, spirituality, even the God word, maybe.
We don't have any good synonyms really, do we?
No, I think we landed on these terms for a reason. They
Yeah.
serve a function that deal with a whole nother kind of realm of experience that has been left out of modern life to a great extent, which I think is the heart of the meaning crisis. And so, how can we somehow reincorporate this worldview, these practices into our modern life with everything that we know now? So, not leaving anything out, but finding some new holistic uh, context or frame for the whole thing. I think that's kind of where we're at. And I think some people are like on the leading edge of that and experimenting with new ways of talking and thinking about these things. But we're definitely not there because there's still a lot of us like searching and blundering around, in our search sometimes.
Oh yeah, yeah. No, I'm certainly in that bracket. I'm certainly doing a lot of blundering. But I think there is as well kind of a strong tradition of the idea of the spiritual seeker, even kind of within established religions. Like there are people who would sort of position themselves as being seekers, and I think kind of like it's not a bad thing to be. It's not a bad thing to not have the answers. It's in fact it's great to not have the answers because you're approaching things with a beginner's mind, and I think that's a very good starting point for any kind of spiritual journey.
I agree. I mean, that ability to remain open to not knowing, um, that shows an ability to tolerate a lot of uncertainty and ambiguity. So I think that actually shows a lot of psychological and spiritual maturation. So not only is it kind of like a beginning point, a kind of attitude to try and cultivate, but maybe that's also the end point too. Like
Mm.
the kind of Socrates, I think it was, saying like, the one thing I know is that I don't know nothing. And he was like supposed to be the wisest man who ever lived. Um, something about that. Like, I love, we both love tarot, and just that card without a number, that's not in the sequence, but the Fool,
Mm.
like cultivating that attitude of the Fool, going like, I don't know what the answer is, but I'm living these questions out, and I'm just finding it really interesting where it takes me. And maybe that kind of the element of the surprising, the unexpected, the interesting, the confounding, you know, maybe we can see those as meaningful.
Yeah, I think absolutely, and I think there's perhaps kind of a time and a place to sort of find beliefs and rest on beliefs. Sometimes it's necessary, like psychologically, to kind of
Hmm.
go, I think this, even if it's something you're holding quite lightly. I think it's very important to be able to do that sometimes.
Yeah, kind of like a life raft, when things are really tumultuous and chaotic and uncertain. Yeah, sometimes you need something just to hold on to, even if it's just for a while.
Yeah, so I think that's really important, and I wouldn't want anyone to think that I'm kind of dismissing beliefs per se because they're such a kind of an important like anchor point for us.
Hmm.
It's just about holding them with a bit more lightness and fluidity, and yeah. So it's kind of a complicated thing to hold in your mind at the same time, but I think it's important.
Yeah. And I think when you're in that moment where you really need something to hold on to, I'm not so sure you're thinking at that time, like, okay, I'm just holding on to this. It's provisional. It's just for the time being to get me through. No, you're holding on to it for dear life.
Yeah,
And then
yeah,
over time, maybe just allowing you to like kind of move away from that or let go of that in order, understanding that there may be something else that comes along. There's something about that that seems healthy, seems realistic, seems open and flexible. I'm not sure that's something that someone can just make happen, but maybe it's just like what life if we allow it, brings us to, um, you know, through like the little catastrophes of our life.
Yeah, because I mean, life's going to throw enough catastrophes at us. There's going to be enough moments where we need a life raft, aren't there?
Yeah.
So you don't have to go kind of looking for it. There's going to be moments where you are just grabbing on for dear life, and yeah, these things kind of feel very real and important. And I think before I sort of started down this whole path, I was absolutely like at a loss in a crisis because my rational mind would just kind of push the life raft away at any moment.
Mm,
I couldn't sort of like hold on to a belief like this is happening for a reason. This is kind of for something because I would instantly reject that. And then without that, then it became an awful lot harder to navigate.
hmm. That's interesting, and that'll be helpful to people. Um, there's something about allowing yourself to like have that life raft, hold on to it for the time being or however long you need it. There's something in that about like being compassionate with yourself, like allowing yourself to grasp onto a life raft of belief, and not being hard on yourself, that you've somehow let down your more intelligent, rational side or something like that, but like being more kind of like tender-hearted toward yourself. Go, no, no, everybody needs this, and yeah, I don't
Yeah,
know. I'm just kind of putting that on the table. It's just a reflection. It doesn't have to go anywhere.
no, I absolutely agree.
Hmm. Well, it's been really nice talking with you, and I like, we both, as we set out on this conversation, it was like we both had the attitude of like, let's see where it takes us, and I like where it took us, and I hope people listening are finding something meaningful about this conversation, or maybe even just feeling a feeling of not being alone with some of these uncertainties and needs and desires and everything we've been talking about that has led us on our spiritual seeking.
I certainly hope so. There's a real sort of sense in spiritual communities that everyone else has got it all figured out somehow, and you'll find enough people who do claim to have the answers. But there's a lot of us who really are just fumbling around. I think that probably all of us actually deep down. So it's good to be able to admit it.
Yeah, yeah. And maybe relieving for people to hear other people say it, Like maybe there should be a church of the fool or something, where all of us, you know, those who have faith without belief, who are okay with uncertainty and bumbling around, because that's really where we are in a kind of a post-Christian West. We've lost so much over the past 1500, 1700 years that were these earth-based, ritualistic, communal experiences. And so we are kind of left with like, we don't have a lot to work with here, and we're going to make a lot of mistakes. But obviously, because of the mental health crisis and degradation of the environment and all of that, obviously we need something. And obviously we're lacking something. Like it's not working, post-enlightenment or wherever we place it, the big shift. It's not been working. So we've got to do something. And we've got to have some imagination. We've got to be kind to ourselves, allow that we're going to make mistakes, not be so harshly judgmental about the New Agers or the woo people. Like they're just trying to find meaning in a a desperate time. So
Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely. I think a Church of the Fool is probably the one church that I would actually attend.
me too. Yeah. Well, let's think about it, but we don't want to get dogmatic about it. Well, it's been
Well,
lovely speaking with you, and I'll put links to your website and the book in the description. But anything else? What are you working on now? What's coming up for you other than promoting this book?
well, I'm actually just about to have a baby, so I'm not going to be working on anything for a little while yet.
Working on mothering, yeah,
Exactly, yes. So that's the big project for the time being, and
yeah, nice.
I'm hoping that's going to lead to some, creative ideas sort of bubbling away. And
Mm. Well, I mean, now that it comes up, I mean, how has becoming a mother fit into your search for meaning and spiritual seeking? Have you found something in being a mother?
Yeah, so I actually wrote the first draft of the book on my first maternity leave, which was crazy, a crazy experience. But I think because I felt so sort of like raw and stripped back and sleep deprived, frankly, it was in a way it made things a little bit easier. I was able just to kind of get into that mindset a bit more readily.
Hmm.
I think on one hand, like I have less time for spiritual practice now. You're so kind of grounded in like the mundane day to day, all the tasks you've got to do. You don't kind of have sort of like half an hour just to sort of sit and meditate or journal really most days. But you're kind of in such a sort of like raw, kind of beautiful state a lot of the time that a lot of these things that most seem quite abstract before but become quite immediate. So it's
Nice.
definitely been. It's probably a whole other book to be honest.
Yeah, the spirit, well, I'm sure there's a million books called like The
I probably
Spirituality of
are.
Motherhood or whatever, right? Motherhood is a spiritual journey, but there's something there that resonates, it's like there's always these connections to what we talked about before, but like that idea that the crack is where the light gets in, where, the grief opened you up to this other kind of experience, um, and mothering and all the demands of mothering and the hormonal changes and everything and the sleep deprivation that also opens you up to something. If opens up to something, and what you make of that, I guess, depends on what you pay attention to. Yeah, but there's that possibility there, that opening, which is really nice.
I think so. I think it can't be anything other than profoundly transformative.
Yeah, it's like life will provide you with these big experiences, these transformative experiences, if you allow it and you're open to it and you don't defend against it, you don't dismiss it. Yeah, so it's again about attitude.
Yeah, I think that's correct. Yeah. But yeah, I've very much enjoyed this conversation as well. I loved all the places we've gone with it. I feel like there's many other places we could have kept
Totally.
going back to.
Yeah.
So yeah, I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you.
Yeah, thank you. And take care. See you down the road.
You as well.
Be in touch.
Bye.
Bye bye.